You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Hello all, Eric Rivenes with the Most Notorious podcast here. Each week I interview an author or historian about a historical true crime, tragedy, or disaster. Subject matter ranges from gunslingers to Gilded Age murder to gangsters to fires to pirates to wild prison breaks. My guests bring their incredible knowledge directly to you. Please subscribe to Most Notorious on your favorite podcast app. Cheers, and have a safe tomorrow.
Hi everyone, this is Scott. If you want to learn about the world's oldest civilizations, find out how they were rediscovered, follow the story of Mark Antony and Cleopatra's descendants over 10 generations, or take a deep dive into the Iron Age or the Hellenistic era, then check out the Ancient World podcast. Available on all podcasting platforms, or go to ancientworldpodcast.com. That's the Ancient World Podcast.
Hello everyone and welcome to another History of the Second World War interview. It has long been my belief that if you want to understand how societies around the world view the Second World War, you have to look at the popular media that was created about the war for that society at any given time. During and after the war years, these were books, films, and radio programs. Then in the 60s and 70s, some of the most famous movies set in the Second World War would be released. Movies like A Bridge Too Far, which is the best World War II movie of all time. And that's a fact, and no, I'm not taking feedback on it. Movies and television shows would continue to be released in the decades that followed, perhaps most notably things like Saving Private Ryan or Band of Brothers, sort of at least in the last few decades. Every single one of these pieces of media says something about how the creators, and in many cases the public masses they wanted to attract, viewed the war and understood history when they were created. In recent decades, another form of media has become an ever greater part of how people, especially younger people, view history. I'm of course talking about video games. With video games consuming an ever-growing number of entertainment hours around the world, the impact that those games have on how history is viewed and interacted with has become an area of study. There are scholarly works built around this topic now, and while this episode will not be about one of those scholarly works, they can be quite interesting, and I highly recommend them. Instead, though, we are going to focus on one video game that covers the Second World War, the first-person shooter Hell Let Loose. Hell Let Loose is a multiplayer game that skews towards a more realistic portrayal of combat during the Second World War. It is built heavily around cooperation and coordination between players, even going so far as to have a simulated radio network with 2 levels of officers and a collection of squads on each team. No game is strictly realistic, but Hell Let Loose is very well grounded in the history of the Second World War, with accurate reproductions of weapons, vehicles, uniforms, and maps. We talk a lot about that during the interview that will be starting here in just a moment. I've now played several hours of the game. I'm totally rubbish at it, but I just want to be clear on that I'm quite bad. But when I play a game like this, and I'm thinking about how they represent history, I'm generally looking for 2 things: how it portrays history, and if it presents realistic scenarios to the player. I think that if a game can do both of those things, honestly, then it is a net positive when it comes to building interests in history, which is what I hope to see from a lot of these games. We talk about this in the interview around Hell Let Loose, and how the information conveyed by the game cannot be a perfect representation of history, due to it being, a game, but it can start players down a journey towards a better understanding. So without further ado, let's get into the interview. Hello everyone, and welcome to another History of the Second World War interview. This time I'm joined by creative director from Expression Games, Matt White, who works on the video game Hell Let Loose. Welcome, Matt.
Hi, Wesley. Thank you for inviting me to the podcast today. Great to be here.
Absolutely. I'm excited to talk about Hell Let Loose, which I've been playing actually pretty recently and having a good time is maybe a difficult thing to say. I've been dying a lot from people I do not see. So
yeah.
Yeah, so let's just jump right in here. Hell Let Loose is a historical World War II first-person shooter. So, how would you describe kind of Hell Let Loose's relationship with its historical setting? I know there's a lot of different players within the Hell Let Loose fan base. Some of them probably always want a greater historical simulation, while
Yeah.
others are just kind of looking for a game with World War II weapons. So how does the game kind of work within those audiences?
Yeah, sure. So, How Let Loose covers quite a bit of World War II history. It started off very much in its infancy, really inspired, I think, by Band of Brothers. So it was very much set in the sort of the maps, the fields of Normandy that people would be familiar with if they've watched that TV show or read the books, etc., from the 101st Airborne. And then over time, it's expanded both the types of maps, the locations of the maps, and the forces that would fight on those maps, and some of the weaponry that it's included. So, for example, right now the game has lots of different locations within Normandy. It has locations within France, within the Ardennes, within Holland, the Eastern Front, and North Africa. And the game really represents those different forces as equal combatants on the battlefield. The uniforms and the weapons and the vehicles are, for the most part, historically representative of what would have been there. But it is a game, as you say, and both sides sort of have an equal chance of being able to achieve their objectives and win the game. And we at Expression Games, we work on that type of work. We work on that type of content, both developing new content and improving the content that's already in the game. I would say I think you're right in the sense that there are quite a few different players in Hell Let Loose, and I think one of the things the game caters for is a variety of different play styles. So when you first play Hell Let Loose, as you finding yourself, the game is quite unforgiving. It's quite lethal. You will be shot by people, the enemy you can't see, and then as you sort of learn the mechanics of the game, and as you try out different roles within the game, there is a role for every type of player. So some people like playing the medic, for example, and they feel they can contribute to their squad by helping the squad and getting the soldiers back up on their feet and back into the combat. Whereas some players like playing a more or a less combative role and making and building defenses. So they play as the engineer. And a lot of those types of roles are both based off sort of roles within the wider genre of video games, I would say, but also inspired by historical references that the teams have sort of lent into. I think what Hell Let Loose tries to do is make sure that when players first start within the game, they don't need a huge amount of prior knowledge of the subject matter so that it's quite accessible. So whereas players who have that knowledge, and there's definitely a lot of players within the community are very knowledgeable about World War II and its history, but you don't need to play it and be successful in the game and to have a good time within the game. I think where what you do need to do, and my advice to a lot of new players when they start, is learn to communicate with the team that you're in, within the squad that you're in. And that in itself is quite an interesting element of both the game, but also of military training and what it would be like to be in a squad in those sort of combative areas.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess you want sort of historical knowledge or historical interest to act more as like an enriching element instead of as a gatekeeping element when it comes to who can enjoy the
Absolutely.
game.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I'm playing the game within the squad, and one of my squad members will shout out, "I can see the enemy tank. I can see a tank." I'm like, great. What type of tank is it? It's a green tank, you know. And whereas some players will be like, it's a Panzerkampfwagen 4, or it's a Panther. What is really interesting is, as a designer and a historian, is the amount of phenomenon you see within the game that replicates phenomenon from World War II. So when you're playing the game in that scenario, often people will shout, "I can see an enemy tank. What tank is it? It's a Tiger." It's not actually a Tiger. It's a Panzer IV. But everyone just assumes it's a Tiger because it's the most intimidating tank in the game. That's always quite interesting. Is the similarities of the sort of human element of playing the game. The game itself doesn't tell you that it's a tiger. If you're on the opposite side, it doesn't tell you it's a tiger. So it's all based on that information at that point in time. So the knowledge of the weapons, or the knowledge of the map, or the knowledge of the uniforms, or the soldiers, or the types of soldiers that were there on the battlefield, that knowledge you have, you're exactly right. It either makes the game more immersive, if you know that, it makes it more enriching, and maybe adds an element to your experience or your knowledge of the period, which has its own merits. And I think a lot of people, when they play Hell Let Loose, they are almost role playing in that scenario. They're imagining themselves in the hedgerows of Normandy and what it would be like, and some of the same trepidation it exists within the game as what exists in when you read first-hand accounts. But at the same time, if you have no knowledge of that, you don't know the difference between a Panzer IV and a Panther. It absolutely makes no difference to the gameplay and your enjoyment of it. I think what I do find often when I'm playing with the game with the community, especially before the match starts and we're talking about the game and the sort of tactics we're going to enjoy, often, which is great to hear, people will say, "Oh, I've been reading about this battle, and this is what happened, and this is what happened," and I'm like, "That's absolutely brilliant. That's really, we couldn't hope for any more from our community, sort of to learn, to expand their knowledge based on their experiences in the game. It's inspired them to learn more about the historical event itself."
Yeah, yeah, and that's always been really interesting for me to hear with in relation to video games and history. Like myself, like a lot of my interest in history like dates back to, playing historical strategy games when I was a kid or whatever, and that kind of unlocking these things that I would go and read more about. So it's interesting. It's always good, I think, to hear about those kind of experiences, even with modern games with a totally new audience.
Yeah, I agree. I was very lucky in that when I was at school, when I was at secondary school, so when I'd been sort of 12 or 13, me and my friends at that age, Dungeons and Dragons had just come out, and we all played Dungeons and Dragons. And the school had a wargaming club that you could go to on a Friday afternoon, and the history teachers and the math teachers would lay out these fantastic large paper maps with small counters, hex-based maps, and play old Avalon Hill. At that time, they just come out Avalon Hill games and SPI games, and me and my friends, we all at that point in our lives, we all played a game called Squad Leader together, which is a very famous old classic hex-based tactical level World War II game. It's been superseded by Advanced Squad Leader, which is quite a complex game, and has a very active level of enthusiasts that still play today, and so forth. So I kind of grew up with that, and this is before really video games were, they were still in their infancy really. So I grew up with that, and my grandfather served in World War II, so I had a few sort of touch points. And where we live, where I grew up here in Lincolnshire in the UK, in my village we have a concrete, we call pillbox, sort of gun emplacement in my village. This is one of the areas the British thought the Germans would invade in Sea Lion. So being surrounded by that history, being involved in it, and then playing games within that history, that was really my upbringing for a long period of my life.
One of the challenging things about a game like Hell Let Loose is that it can be very difficult to approach the game as a new player. I think a major reason for this is because of the limitations on how the game can present feedback to the user while staying true to how it's trying to represent sort of late Second World War combat. What role do you think the community has in helping with that new player on ramp?
Because the community are, I think, with video games, when I play the game with the community, they're absolutely lovely, really nice, and very diverse, which is great. I play the game. I'm in a squad, both with people from UK, from Europe, also other nations like South Africa or the States or Canada, and everyone kind of comes together. And I think it's a really kind of sort of life affirming situation when you're playing a World War II game where you have so many people work together against what is a very difficult objective. I think it's really cool.
Yeah, I've definitely been. I think my second game of Hell Let Loose was on Remagen.
Yep.
And you say that you designed the maps for both teams to be able or have an equal chance of winning. And my experiences on Remagen is that both teams have equal chances of losing, just kind of sitting at
Yeah.
that bridge the whole time. But
Bridge. Yeah.
but yeah, that is interesting. I think that games like this, I think the new player experience is probably always a challenge, right? Always a balance of, in my experience, I was like, okay, I just, died, no idea what just happened there. And then,
Yeah.
want to make sure that new players are like, okay, well, I'm not just going to leave now because I'm frustrated. I'm going to jump in and figure this out.
Yeah. Yeah. I think when people start playing Hell Let Loose for the first time, I think there's an awful lot of great YouTube content about tips and hints of how to play, and there are many great content creators out there that really support the game and help explain the mechanics of the game. I think everyone at Expression and Team 17 totally would say we're learning how to do a better job constantly of explaining how to play the game within the game itself. And that's something that we spend a lot of time talking about how best to do that. And it is a sort of a gradual approach, I think. And I think also the community themselves, often when I'm playing the game, someone will say, I am new, never played before. What do I do? Please help me. Everyone's eager to jump in and help and give advice. And I think one of the key things for Hell Let Loose compared to other video games as a game is that it plays very differently in many ways than a lot of other traditional first person shooters. In many ways, I think Hell Let Loose we think of it as much a strategy game, sometimes even more of a strategy game than a traditional first person shooter like Call of Duty or Doom or anything like that. And I think once the player understands the tempo and how to use the environment, and the game is lethal. You will get killed a lot. If you run across that open bit of field, yeah, then that's going to happen. You're the human eye is better at picking out a moving target in open terrain. So stick with your squad. Listen to the squad leader, the officer, and you'll have a much better time. The best matches I take part in is where the squad are all communicating together. It's all good natured and friendly, and there's a bit of squad banter. We're playing a World War II shooter for sure. But everyone's working together to try and overcome what is a very hard objective. And it's the that sort of spirit to try and overcome that objective. What is interesting, I find interesting, is the sense of what I would call the morale of the squad, the morale of the side, and it mirrors very well what I read a lot about. I've heard veterans talk about from first-hand accounts is that if the morale of the squad is high and people are working together and looking after each other and watching each other's backs and positive about, then invariably the side will win. And when the morale breaks, when the squads start blaming each other or they blame the commander, as soon as I hear officers blame the commander, I'm like, we're done. It's done. We're going to lose. No way. Very hard to come back from that. So it's an interesting phenomenon about playing a video game about World War II, where the morale is such a contributing factor. I've seen matches where one side has had excellent morale and lost every single point until the last point, and then turned the whole match around. And the morale, the camaraderie, um, is absolutely phenomenal, and it pushes the side through. The other, and probably the last point I'd like to talk about is the what is interesting, and not everyone experiences this depending on what role you play. So if you're playing as the officer, you can hear all of your squad. They all talk to you, whether they're using verbal communications or they're using the ping system or non-verbal communications. But the officers can also hear all the other officers from all the other squads. And they can hear the officer who's running in the tanks in the armor squads. And they can hear the commander. So when you're playing as a rifleman or as a medic or something like that, you're just hearing your squad. But as an officer, you've got dozens of voices in your head all at the same time. And they're all conveying information to each other. My squad have seen a tank. My squad have done this. My squad is doing that. The commander's asking the squads nicely, sometimes more forcibly, can you defend the point? Can you attack the point? And what's interesting is that ability, that test of being able to listen to a lot of information and dissect it in a split second from a sort of a military training perspective, or having that feeling, the weight of responsibility in that sort of officer leadership role when you have all this information being bombarded at you is super compelling, and some people thrive in that environment and some people find it's too much. But it does help you, I think, as a historian, it helps you understand how in the battlefield environment at that tactical level, boots on the ground tactical level, where you'll have all this information, how good snap decisions are made and equally bad snap decisions are made. Makes you understand, appreciate a lot more, I think, the decisions made on the battlefield, certainly in World War II. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think back to some experiences I've had in the game where it was certainly a situation where you speak of morale, but what I was experiencing was more like there was one team that clearly like took the initiative and kept the initiative, right? Where
Yep.
my team was always my team because I've never been on the winning side of one of these, of course. But my team like was disjointed and everybody was just kind of sitting in a spot waiting for things to happen while the enemy team
Yeah.
was just doing whatever they wanted to do. And you definitely see when you read into the history, like you see situations where those types of things happen. Specifically, the podcast is covering the invasion of France right now. So
Yep.
there are situations in which it's like the Germans are just like do, and the French are just sitting there waiting for them, right?
Waiting. Yeah.
And I experienced that in some of these games.
Yeah, definitely the I think the role of leadership within Hell Let Loose as a player type is, I always say to when new people join Expression and they're learning about how to play it loose, I will often say, if you want to win, you build garrisons, you build spawns. If you want to win, you take out the enemy spawns, you defend, you attack, you try and encircle, you use all these sort of military-esque tactics, and then they work. The chain of command, when it works well in Hell Let Loose, works. And it is it's super it's one of the things I enjoy about learning about the historical period, outside of just the content, but learning about the human condition under those sort of situations. And of course, people are enjoying Hell Let Loose. They want to have fun. They want to find it competitive. They also, for the vast majority, want to win. They want to get into the fight. And there's a time, certainly, when I play Hell Let Loose as an officer, I'm particularly tactically very aggressive, because I believe that there's a time to be able to turn that really ramp up that aggression level tactically to try and confuse the enemy. And I think the game has that depth where it allows you to do that. So yeah.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Do you have self-care non-negotiables? I take a walk every day. Rain, shine, snow, it's happening. Maybe therapy needs to be one of those things. Maybe one of your days needs to be a therapy day. But it's sometimes hard to add yet another thing to the calendar, and that's where BetterHelp comes in. BetterHelp is entirely online, so you can do it from the coziness of your own home, or from anywhere else, for that matter. To get started, all you have to do is fill out a questionnaire, which will help match you with a licensed therapist. You can then switch therapists at any time. It's flexible, it's convenient, and it's just a few clicks away. So never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/WWII today to get 10% off of your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/WWII. So when you're kind of looking at content to put into the game, like what does the research process look like for the team? I think that there are very sort of concrete things, a specific model of tank or a uniform where maybe there's exact information, but then there's also kind of less quantitative or less, concrete areas like map design, maybe. So what does the process look like for your team?
It's really extensive and it's really varied depending on the subject matter. So I'll pick a few different examples. So, for example, if we are interested in adding a new weapon into the game, we have a fantastic hard surface art team, and they go away and gather photography reference or images from both published books and from the net, and they go through an extensive research. They look at every single nook and cranny over every single weapon, every single screw, every single millimeter of that weapon they know inside out, and that's a pretty well defined, I think, process for hard surface artists. And then we take that weapon and we use reference from the period. I think this is always the trick, I suppose, when you're making games about history, is understanding the reference you're looking at. So, for example, when we look at how a soldier would operate a weapon or they would carry a weapon, how they were trained to do so is very different in the modern day military compared to the period military of that time. And that's very different sometimes than, say, for example, how reenactors or actors would use those sort of weapons. So we spend a lot of time trying to get footage or reference from the period, and then often I will work with them and try and ensure that the footage we're looking at isn't propaganda led footage, which often shows sort of a misrepresentation, in my opinion, of how soldiers would behave and how they would, work the environment or how they would operate their weapons. So we're looking for and this is the hardest thing. We're striving for the truth, and that is in itself is a never-ending task, I would say. The same pretty much applies for the uniforms. The uniforms have a different process. They have a different department of artists. They have what we call the character artists, and the character artists incredibly fastidious over every single detail of the uniform, every single stitch, color variation. World War II has a challenge in that, by the nature of the historic period, a lot of the photography we're looking at is in black and white, or it's been colored by another artist, or if it's in color, the film quality or the film type will change the colors, etc. And if you look at historical what's in what we call museums or private collections, again, those items, the coloring and detailing could have changed in time. So that task is requires a huge amount of work. How we often end up with the uniforms is we'll find a photograph or several photographs of a particular soldier, and we'll base the uniform off that photo as that soldier wore the uniform. So I have a particular we have a particular thing where we really want to, especially as time goes on, as we learn, is to represent the soldiers with their uniforms, that how they wore them in the field. So not how they wore them on the parade ground, not how they wore them on sort of PR or publicity images, sorry, but how they wore them in the field. And I think there's a big difference between those two things. And we really strive to do that. And I think the reason for that is that we want to make sure that we represent the soldiers and their uniforms in the way that they were at that point in history. I think we feel a great emphasis and a great sort of level of respect in doing that, and that's really important to us. But it takes a phenomenal amount of time, and then once you've got that reference, then you can start the process of actually recreating that uniform, and it goes through. multiple passes of review. The character art team have and the hard surface team have a fantastic level of knowledge of their particular points of the subject matter, and it's ever expanding. And sometimes, you'll come across an image, and we'll sit there looking at it for days at times, different points in the day, and we'll go, why is he wearing it like that? And often, again, understanding the reference, so we'll question ourselves: where was the photograph taken? Is it the Eastern Front? Is it in Western Europe? What unit, what division was the soldier in? What was the date? So therefore, we can look at what happened in those dates prior to understand. And with that level of understanding that we have as creators of World War II content, then it helps us make the sort of the best decisions. We're very lucky in the sense that World War II is a very documented period of history, and that infinitely helps. It does sometimes cause issues and problems because you have to wade through a lot of stuff, I suppose. Some things are more documented than others. So when we think about the maps, the actual locations, and they go through a massive iterative process of working out the best location for the map, and it so varies on the particular location. So, for example, we fairly recently released a map for Mortain, and we were super interested in representing Operation Lutish within the game. We felt that Hell Let Loose had done a wonderful job of representing the beach landings at D-Day and some of the sort of initial fighting through Normandy, but hadn't really represented that part of the Normandy campaign as it was coming to its end. And I had played a war game simulation where I could see the importance of Mortain, and I could see the decision-making process that the German forces had gone through to move their forces into Mortain to try and stem the American advance. And we thought that would be a really good story to tell within Hell Let Loose, or at least have a map on that location. And then the challenge for the team is we need to understand almost at a per meter basis who was there, what was happening, where the roads were, where the major physical landmarks are, so particular buildings or churches or hills, what exactly happened. And because Hell Let Loose is a tactical game, as you said, you're playing a first person shooter, a first person perspective, you can see everything. So it's not like a scale of game where the camera's zoomed out and you just have the whole map of France. It's not like that at all. So we have to really understand that, and that takes a lot of time. And the hardest thing then is the map that we pick has to do all those things. It has to represent the battle, has to show the key landmarks that we want to show in an authentic and believable manner, and it has to give both sides an equal chance of winning the game. And that's the trick. That's the kind of the challenge that we set ourselves. So no one side can have the upper hand in terms of where they start or in terms of when they're fighting over sort of key objective points. And that just takes a huge amount of iteration. We do use height map data. So we can get height map data so we can understand better the topography of the landscape. But yeah, so it's as you can imagine, it's a huge volume of work to gather all that research. So, for example, a uniform, we're talking weeks, months of work to do that. A map, months and months of work to do the maps. Sometimes we look at locations and we change our mind when doing the research of which battle or which part of the history we want to choose. So for a period of time, we were looking at a lot of maps from the Soviet-Finnish Winter War, 1939-1940. And when we were doing that research on that particular piece, some of the battles the the obvious battles that we were looking at, actually we changed our mind and went, it's a great historical thing. It ticks every single box, but not this box. So therefore we move on. We find a better location. So yeah, it's an iterative process, and it requires a great deal of hard work from the maps, certainly from the level design team, and they have a very good understanding of the mechanics of Hell Let Loose, have an excellent understanding of their history, and what is always great to work with people, work with colleagues where they will do their own historical research and validate your own research, and work tirelessly, I would say, on making the maps as playable as we can make them and keeping that historical authenticity there. So yeah.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that sometimes you run into a problem of having a lot of references for something like a gun or something, but most of it being like or some of it being propaganda footage and things like that. I guess you're somewhat lucky in that the Second World War is probably one of the first conflicts where you have this like mass of media to pull from to reference. Yep. But there are some downsides to that in that not all of that media is designed to portray truth.
Yeah. Yeah. This it's really interesting, and it's very layered, I would say. So we're always learning, constantly learning all the time about things we've got in the game or things that we're looking at. And a lot of the people on the team are avid, devour World War II history. So, for example, we included, this literally happened literally the other day. In the game, we included the gammon bomb for the British and the Commonwealth forces. We did loads of research on the gammon bomb. We understood what it was. We tested it with the community. So often when we put something new in, we'll do a play test with the community. That anyone who's playing on PC at the minute, anyway, can join in and give us feedback. And we felt like we understand this weapon really well. Community really responded well to it, liked it. And then the other night, I was reading Saul David's book on the British Airborne, which is a fantastic book called Sky Warriors. And he cites that the British Airborne, and to quote, destroyed a Panther tank with the gammon bomb. And I sat there and I was like, I did not know that. I did not know that. I did not know that a Panther tank could be destroyed by a gammon bomb. So the next day, I'm talking to the game designer, and this particular game designer had done a huge amount of research into the gammon bomb, and we sat there sort of for a while talking about how would you destroy a Panther tank. So you're learning constantly about the subject matter, and what we would then do is validate that. So we'll go and look for other references of that particular action and see when Saul David's talking about destroying a panther, does he mean disabling a panther? Do you know what I mean? So for example, we do that. So to get to the hard truth of things requires so much sort of working. I think in time you learn with the subject matter about how to very carefully, be very wary of what is obviously propaganda and sometimes not so obviously propaganda, especially with photography from the period. And that's just a question, I think, really of self-learning and learning the subject matter. It's very important for us for Hell Let Loose to not represent one faction, one side, one force, one nation in a non-representative way or in a superior way to the others. So we're very careful as to what the voice of the game is as a voice about World War II. And that's super important to us. So, and that also, I think, comes into the gameplay. So, the game, this example I often give, the game has Stalingrad in it. If you play on the German side, if you were always going to lose Stalingrad, it wouldn't make a game. It would make an experience, but not a game. So we often spend a lot of time thinking about making sure that the game does represent those forces in a equal manner, both in terms of the gameplay and how we name them and how we portray them. Myself in particular spend agonizing amount of times how we phrase naming of everything because of because of the history, because of the importance of that history. I'm very lucky in that Team 17, who's the publisher of the game, really respect and support a lot of the historical decisions that we make. So again, when we're talking about the level of propaganda, so for example, in the game we have the map at Driel, part of Operation Market Garden. And when we first came to work on the game, and I was looking through the maps, I was like, okay, well, the game's got Driel. When I think of Driel, I don't think of the British airborne, I think of the Polish airborne. So as a team, we sat down and went, okay, the game really should represent those Polish forces as part of Operation Market Garden. It should respectfully include them, and by doing so, acknowledge their contribution towards Operation Market Garden. And as a team, we all agreed that was the thing that we should do. We went to Team 17 and said, hey, look, we really believe in this. We really want to add the Polish airborne uniform and do all the work that's required to do that. And they listened and said, yeah, absolutely. If you think it's important, then we'll support you with that. So, and that's where, interestingly, one of the really interesting things working within a game of professionals, a lot of game developers, is that a lot of their knowledge itself is what they've been taught at school, what they've seen in movies. Not everybody on the team has. We don't ask them all to read every single book by Anthony Beevor or James Holland or Max Hastings, etc. We don't. It'd be unfair. But what I often find is I have to almost, at times, sort of almost not de-school them in their thinking, but change their thinking about their history to the facts. And that's quite an interesting part of the development process, I would say.
Yeah, you mentioning using, incorporating the Polish airborne units. I think that's a really good example of prior knowledge helping to enrich the experience and kind of reaching all of the different groups. Because as somebody who would know that the Poles are supposed to be there, I'd be like, oh, look, they did the Poles. And then you have another audience where they're like, wait, why are the Poles here? Let me go check Wikipedia. And then the third group just doesn't care at all and is just there to shoot people. But, that's great.
Yeah, I think it's, for us, that's really important, because we want to make sure that we talk a lot within the team about being respectful to the history and making sure that the forces, and making sure that the maps and the weapons and the vehicles, that they are represented within the game. And then our hope is, in fact, with the example of Mortan, I was looking at one of the Hell Let Loose forums. Contrary to what a lot of the community think, the development team, we do constantly look at the forums.
I don't know. I looked at the forums, and I don't know. Oof, I may not go back.
So there are a lot of people with outspoken views, and what was good when we just before we released the map on Mortan, someone on the forum said, "Oh, I went to the bookstore and I bought a book on about the Battle of Mortan to learn about the Battle of Mortan, ready for when the game comes out. And the book they bought was exactly the same one that I used." And I thought that was great for the team, because the team can see that the people playing the game sort of have that level of respect for the content as well. Obviously, there's a lot of people who play Hell Let Loose that, as you rightly say, they just want to run around, have fun with their friends, and blow stuff up and shoot at the enemy, and have banter, good-natured banter, and within their squad, and the game facilitates that brilliantly well. But I think one of the reasons Hell Let Loose is so popular within the community is that it does offer that level of immersion, and that level of a sort of a gateway experience into learning more about the period.
That leads into kind of another question I have, where we've talked a lot about the audiences for the game and how they approach it differently. However, there's always going to be design decisions
Yeah.
that are kind of made to make the gameplay better, like the game part of it. Even if it kind of pulls away from history a bit because of the
Yeah.
decisions that are made. So how does the team kind of balance those decisions? Do you think there's like always a constant danger of kind of wandering too far in either the simulation or not simulation direction?
Yeah, to be honest with you, there is that. It is a fine line. I could give some examples of this. How we approach the design of the game is always to start with the history, and we strive to understand the history, to understand the battle that's taking place, to understand it's part of the campaign, and to understand that part of how it fit or it fits or fitted into the overall history of World War II. Is to understand the cost in materials and to understand the cost of manpower, to understand the impact it had on both the populations, both at home and within the area where the battle took place. So, for example, with Operation Market Garden, to understand the impact it made on the people of Holland, to understand the psyche of the soldiers taking part on both sides, to understand that level of the history. And when you have that understanding, then you can start making design decisions. Say, okay, we can understand that at parts of the war, for example, the German supply lines were incredibly poor. And we can understand how could we represent that in the game? Should we represent that in the game? If you get into your Panther tank and start the engine and the game says, sorry, you've got no fuel, is that going to enrich the experience, or is that going to frustrate the player? And sometimes the answer is, well, that probably will, without that understanding, without us having to explain it to the player, that will frustrate them. So we make an informed decision about whether to include that mechanic or not. Sometimes, though, we do prototype out such mechanics. And sometimes we end up with the conclusion, yeah, we should absolutely include that into the game. So it sort of depends on what the subject matter is, but we always start with the understanding. So we can because I think in our opinion, if we don't have that understanding, we're not making informed decisions. And if we're not making informed decisions, then that's not the best way to design a game like Hell Let Loose. Another great example of this is around the Sten gun. So we introduced different types of Sten guns into the game, and we had found lots of first-hand accounts of soldiers that were very candid in their expression of how accurate a Sten gun was, or not, as the case may be. And we put that into the game. So the game wasn't 100% accurate. And what we found was the community, their expectation was that when I aim at something and I shoot that thing, I expect the gun to shoot the thing I've aimed at. So when we did a play test, and that's partly why we do play tests, we could understand from the community's point of view, no one in the community picked up on, well, it's a Sten gun. What do you expect? So we went, okay, we'll change it. It's no problem. It's perfectly within our ability to change that thing. So we sort of learn from the community what their expectation is based against the knowledge. The other thing I did talk to the team about the Sten gun was that it would often misfire. They were quite in many ways, quite a crude weapon. And you drop it, it fires. You bang it, it fires. And I think it was James Holland's. I think it might have been James Holland's book, where unfortunately tank crew were killed because their Sten gun had accidentally fired because it'd been dropped within the tank. And I said to the team, would it be good to have the gun just occasionally just go off? And then someone said, well, yeah, but if you're running behind me, Matt, and you accidentally shoot me, I'm going to be really, really, really upset with you. And then you're going to have to explain, I don't know why the gun fired. I fell to the ground, the gun fired. So you're always looking for the truth, and then you can make those decisions on what the community want. And we sometimes, like I said, we'll put something in, and then we will learn ourselves and say, hey, yeah, maybe the community are right about the Sten. Maybe it does need to be 100% pinpoint accurate at this distance. It's fine, So there's always that sort of inherent sort of back and forth. And you have to, and this is where a lot of that design decision comes in, is to make sure that both sides have an equal chance of winning. Because I think if ever the players feel, oh, the Germans are so depending on uh, for example, we did a lot of work on the difference in the Wehrmacht between Barbarossa, the beginning of the Eastern Front, compared to the state they were in at the end of the Eastern Front, right? And I was like, could we have different years and have different gameplay differences so that the player can have some understanding of that? So there's always conceptually these ideas floating around within the team about how could we better represent the accuracy of the history, but in a way that the players will accept and learn about. And I think, yeah, it's a fine balance, and we'll be the first to say sometimes we get it wrong, but we'll change it to make it right for people. So yeah, the Stengun one keeps yeah, it's a good one.
It's the challenge of wanting to have that, I would call it, interesting and fun historical stuff in there, like with the Sten gun, or like the German tanks having no fuel, but then
Yeah,
also not being able to assign a reading list to every player before you
yeah,
get into a
exactly.
game to describe
Yeah,
it.
and I think that's always that's the where the line is what can we include where you don't have to have that prior knowledge. You don't. It's not a requirement, and that's the sort of the test. But we'll always start with with the sort of historically accurate. And we had another example where we were like, you look at the operational success of the Tiger tank. Yeah, most of them not really driving around very much, and so there was a lot of discussion about, well, when we want to progress the or revise any of the handling of the vehicles, should we change aspects of particularly of the Tiger compared to some of the other German tanks? I think the other thing we do look at as well is when we're looking at new content or thinking about what possible potential new content is, we'll look at some of the historical data or the data around the numbers. So, for example, and I think there's a lot of people in the community at some point would love to get a Sturmgeschütz into the game. The Stug was readily, one of the more manufactured vehicles in the game. So that's a historical fact. We believe, to the best of our level of knowledge, there were lots of Stugs. So we should include the Stug into the game. And then we have to work out how to make it as enjoyable to play or compelling to play when you're in a vehicle that doesn't have a turret, so you've got to coordinate a lot more effectively. So there are always these sort of mechanics or content that we constantly discuss and constantly maybe create little prototypes for and see how successful they are and work on. So yeah, part is it's one of the things I think as a team that we spend a lot of effort in is constantly thinking, constantly looking, how can we make the experience better for the players? How can we improve the quality of life components of the game? But also, how can we add new things into the game that will enrich their experience and hopefully enrich their appreciation of the history side?
Yeah, yeah. The Stug example is interesting because people who know the history be like, look, they got the Stug in the game. Like there were so many of these built during the war and used in the fighting, but then other players are just like, yeah, but I don't have a turret. What am I supposed to do
Yeah,
here without
what
a
am I supposed
turret?
to do? Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And there are other. I think we introduced a few different new tanks into the game. So we introduced the Churchill for the British forces, for example, into the game. So there's always, I'll always tell the team and Team 17, there's no shortage with World War II. We're never going to run out of things we could include. Um, and often how we'll look at what to include is through that lens of how will it make the gameplay experience better? Will it make it more expansive for players? So, it adds something new to the game, and we kind of look at it through through that lens. And the team, we're very lucky, I think, to have such a team that's so dedicated to both the historical side, but also the gameplay side. And we play the game all the time. We play the game every single Friday as a team with our colleagues over at Team 17, which is a great way to let off a bit of steam on a Friday afternoon. So, with my colleagues, and we also play the game extensively within the community as well. So, playing with the people in the community, and I never tell, obviously, I don't tell people what I do. So I'm just always listening. And I pick up on both what will make the game better for the community members, but also very interested in how they perceive the sort of the authenticity of the history as well. So yeah, it's a really great part of the job. That is definitely makes it a brilliant, fun project to work on, I would say.